The best way to learn to read Chinese is to read text you can understand without constantly using a dictionary. As a beginner though, such texts aren't easy to find, but let's have a look at the best reading resources I know for beginners. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to continue our discussion about learning to read in Chinese. And last time we talked about challenges that you will face as a learner and how to overcome them. If you haven't had the chance to listen to episode 67, you can check that out if you want to know more about the general challenges that you face when learning to read Chinese and how to overcome them. In this episode, though, we will focus on some of these challenges and a specific one which is about finding learning materials. Because, like I said in last week's episode, finding reading material that is at or below your level so that you can read much more text is very beneficial but not easy. You are essentially confined to materials that are written specifically for beginners because anything authentic will be too difficult, and even most materials written for beginners, including textbooks, will typically be too hard. They will contain too many new words, too much new grammar, and so on, and you will end up reading just a few hundred characters, even if you maybe spend hours. This is very far from extensive reading when you read a lot and you try to absorb the language automatically because you understand almost everything, and then absorbing the things you don't understand becomes possible. I'm not going to dwell too much on this point because we talked about it last week, and we also spent an entire episode, number 16, talking only about extensive reading and why it is useful. So rather than just listing a few resources that I think are useful, I have grouped them into 7 different categories, and each category will then contain several specific resources that I think you might want to check out. So that means we are actually not looking at the 7 best resources, but rather the 50 best resources or something like that. But I doubt that many will complain that there are too many things to read, because indeed the problem is always that you don't have enough to read rather than the opposite. In this discussion of reading resources for beginners, I have included both those that are free and those that are paid. Because for some people, if you don't have money to spend, well, then you need free resources, otherwise you won't have anything to read. I understand that. But it's also important to know that if you are willing to pay, there are some resources that are just better, and that we can't really expect everything that is of the highest quality to be freely available. So, like I said, I will include both. But if you are only interested in the free resources, I suggest that you check out episode 33, where we talked about the best free reading resources, not just for beginners, but for everybody. Okay, I think that's enough of an introduction, so let's get to the first type of resource, which is textbooks. And I know this might sound a little bit boring, but bear with me. I mentioned this in the previous episode too, but the main problem with textbooks is that they get more and more difficult the further you progress through it. And you might think, well, that's a good thing, right? I'll learn more. No, this is not what we're after here. We're after reading more text. We're after extensive reading. And that will not happen if you constantly throw in a new grammar point or a new word or several new words in every sentence. That's intensive reading, and you can do that occasionally, but it shouldn't be the main thing that you're doing. So why do I bring up textbooks here, which seems to be the opposite of what we want? No, not really. You can use more than one textbook. Let's say you have access to 5 textbooks, and of course you don't have to necessarily buy all of these. You can borrow them at the library, some of them might be available online, and you can purchase some of them if you want. So if you start with the first textbook and you study chapters 1 to 5, this will be like any other studying. There will be many new words, new grammar, and so on. And if you started learning Chinese yesterday, everything will be new. Not a single character will be known, and you will have to study a lot to get through the first 5 chapters. Fine. But now you move on to textbook number 2. You don't finish textbook number 1. You just do a few chapters in it. Then you move to textbook number 2 and do the same number of chapters. So you go through chapters, say, 1 to 5 in textbook number 2. Now, most of the vocabulary in this second textbook will overlap with what you just learned. And if this is a beginner textbook, almost everything will overlap because you learn the same greetings, the same basic pronouns, and so on in all of these books. So the dialogues that you read in textbook 2 should mostly contain vocabulary and grammar that you already know. And then you move on to textbook number 3, which will be even easier, and then to number 4 and 5 and so on until you get bored. Maybe you don't have to do 5 textbooks, you can do this with 2, 3 or whatever you want, but the point is that this is a great method of accessing content that is written with an extremely low number of characters, which is otherwise quite difficult. So which textbooks do I recommend? This is a very tricky topic. I haven't looked at all the available textbooks, obviously, and each person's situation is different and preferences are different and so on. But if we look at the most popular textbooks, I think Integrated Chinese ranks very well. It comes in a simplified and a traditional edition. It has workbooks and so on that I don't think are very good. But the main textbook is pretty good for self-studying. This is a good book to have as your starting book, the one where you're supposed to actually learn these things and understand them. Another popular textbook series is New Chinese Practical Reader, which also comes in simplified and traditional. And then we have textbooks which are popular in Taiwan specifically, such as A Course in Contemporary Chinese and Practical Audiovisual Chinese. Since the idea here is to use these textbooks mostly for reading practice, or listening practice, you can do the same thing for listening, obviously, the quality of explanations, exercises, and so on doesn't matter that much because that's not what you're using these textbooks for anyway. So just find something you can get for free, something you can find cheaply, or maybe borrow at a library. There are literally hundreds of textbooks out there, and it doesn't really matter which you get. Let's continue to reading resource number 2, which is graded readers. So graded readers are books that are written with a specific vocabulary level in mind. And when it comes to Chinese, this is usually measured in characters or words. And the relationship between these two depend on your level, but to give you some idea, Level 1 of the new HSK, that's a proficiency test for Chinese learners, contains 300 characters but 500 words. This conversion is not perfect and it changes the more you learn because the number of new characters will decrease but the number of new words will increase. So graded readers are the opposite of textbooks that become more difficult the further into them you get. A graded reader becomes easier the further into it you get. Because once you learn the words that are crucial for this particular story and setting, there really shouldn't be that many new words to worry about. The purpose here is not to introduce more words and new grammar all the time. Instead, it is to write engaging content using the words and the grammar that you already know. So as you keep reading, it becomes easier, which allows you to cover more text. Graded readers are typically also much longer than the texts and dialogues you see in textbooks, so a single graded reader might contain more actual Chinese reading material than an entire textbook does. There are many graded readers out there that are good, but they all require you to have a certain amount of vocabulary under your belt. So first off is Mandarin Companion, and they start their breakthrough level at only 150 characters. So naturally, if you started learning Chinese last week, these stories will still be quite difficult, but they are among the easiest you can find. I will put a link to my review of Mandarin Companion in the description. Another graded readed series is Chinese Breeze, and their lowest level is 300 words, so that is slightly more difficult than Mandarin Companion's Breakthrough, but still fairly easy. We also have Sinolingua's Rainbow Bridge, which starts at a similar level. Let's continue to reading resource number 3, reading apps. And these are apps that are specifically meant to provide you with reading content of different kinds, which are typically graded in the same way as graded readers are, but not as carefully, and the quality can vary quite a lot. Many of these apps seem to focus on producing a lot of content rather than just a few texts that are very carefully produced. So if you want something with very high quality, I suggest you look at printed books rather than these apps. But these apps can still be great because they provide you with bite-sized chunks of Chinese that you can read, and it's also much easier to get started with something like that. It feels less daunting, etc. Most of these apps also have various forms of scaffolding, such as built-in dictionaries and other things that can come in handy. Now I'm going to recommend some apps in this category, and if I find any discounts to access premium versions of these apps, I will make sure to put it in the written article that comes with this podcast episode. So please check the description. So first out is Do Chinese, which is an app that offers you bite-sized reading and listening, and they have a variety of topics on different levels. The app also has the smoothest interface of all these, and it's a pleasure to use. Next up is the Chairman's Bao, which focuses on easy-to-read news, specifically written for beginners. We also have WordSwing, where I have spent a lot of time developing text adventure games, and most of these are on a slightly higher level, but there are easier games too, and the game Escape is completely free to play. That's it for reading apps. Let's move over to reading resource number 4, vocabulary apps. So these are strictly speaking not apps for reading, but when you are at a very low level, acquiring some basic vocabulary is kind of necessary to be able to read anything, and it is worth pointing out that some vocabulary building apps can be useful to use. And I don't mean that as reading practice in itself, it's more a support, so maybe it's kind of cheating to putting it as a reading resource here. But since it is so useful, I'm going to do that anyway. In this category, we have some apps that are like Duolingo but actually suited for learning Chinese, such as Chinese Skill, which you can use to build basic vocabulary and some grammar. We also have a number of flashcard apps, such as Pleco, which also is a very good dictionary that you should definitely check out, Anki, which is completely free and very flexible, and Scritter, which is especially good for writing characters. Again, in case I have discounts or other offers for these, I will put them in the text version of this podcast episode. And this also goes for reviews that I've written of these apps and many others. So feel free to head over to Hacking Chinese if you want to learn more about these. Reading resource number 5 is reading websites, and this is just a general category for sites that offer different kinds of reading, and these are a little bit between graded readers and apps, so they offer the same kind of content as the apps, but they do it online. Most of the time, these are used to advertise other services such as tutoring or courses of different kinds. The ones I recommend here are completely free though, and you can of course just ignore the other parts of the service if you want to. So a couple of suitable ones that I recommend for beginners are Mandarin Bean, Chinese Reading and Comprehension, Chinese at Ease, Chinese Reading Practice, Yes Chinese, and My Chinese Reading. And as you probably noticed there, these websites are called almost the same thing and it's hard to keep track of which is which. But you should check all of them out, they all have their pros and cons. And like I said before, there are links to all of these in the article on Hacking Chinese, so you can check them out for yourself. Now over to reading resource number 6, transcripts from beginner listening resources. And I want to point this out because it might not be obvious or people might think that it's not good for some reason, but using the transcripts from a podcast or some listening resource that you're using can be very effective. The dialogues that most beginner podcasts consist of are actually quite suitable for reading material. And yes, of course, there is a difference between formal written Chinese and colloquial spoken Chinese, but as a beginner, the difference is not something you need to worry about at all. Anything that you learn will be useful both for spoken and written Chinese, and once you get to an intermediate or even advanced level, well, then it makes sense to try to figure out how can I write more formally if you need to do that. But as a beginner, like I said, you don't need to worry about this, so using spoken sources actually works quite well. And besides, these dialogues are usually not actually real people talking to each other, they are actually written dialogues that someone has read aloud. So they are actually more like reading material to begin with. Of course, if you were to actually record the conversations of native speakers and write them down in a transcript format, that wouldn't really be very suitable because, like we said last time, authentic texts are very difficult and these speakers will use lots of words that you've never seen, and writing them down, well, maybe it becomes a little bit easier, but still it is going to be much harder than anything you find in a textbook, for example. One thing I want to mention here is that many podcasts offer the audio episodes for free, but then charge for things like transcripts and exercises. And in this case, since we're talking about reading, it is actually the transcripts that you're after. So to use this resource, you should expect to pay. And if you're doing that, you should probably also consider what kind of listening resources you need, and then simply use those for reading practice as well. Like before, I don't want to get into too much detail on each of these resources, so head over to the article on Hacking Chinese if you want that. But a few podcasts that I recommend are Chinese Pod and iMandarin Pod. I should also mention that there is an issue with many of the podcasts in that they say that they have novice or elementary episodes, but when you look at them, they are typically much harder than an elementary textbook would be, and so most podcasts that I would normally recommend for listening practice are actually a little bit too hard if you just started learning. And they will also be more like an audio course in that they teach you about the grammar and so on. And that's not really what you want. We're only after the Chinese content here. And often, like I said, that tends to be a little bit too difficult. This means that we have now reached reading resource number 7, which is interactive reading for beginners. And I bring this up here because I think it's important to remember that the purpose of language is to communicate, and that interacting with other people can be very good for both learning and motivation. And doing this is pretty simple because you can just use a text chat on your phone or an app or email or some other platform. It doesn't really matter. Naturally, you need someone to chat with, and here there are several options depending on what your situation is like. But first, if you have friends who speak Chinese, you can start text chatting with them. If they know that you just started learning Chinese, they will be able to adjust their language somewhat and make it easier for you to understand. Now, not all native speakers are good at doing this, and not all are willing to do it either, so it's not something you should just expect people to do, but you can find great chatting partners this way, if you already have friends who speak Chinese. If you don't, you can try to find some, maybe by starting a language exchange, and you can do this locally, or you can use apps like HelloTalk to find people who are learning your native language, and you can have a language exchange. And of course, this can be done using text messages. We are talking about the written language here after all, not the spoken language. Another option, if you have the means to do so, is to hire a teacher to chat with. And normally teachers, of course, have lessons with you and things like this, but you can always find someone who is willing to type with you occasionally and keep a conversation going that way. The advantage of this option is that teachers are much better at gauging your level and actually using words that you have learned. If you just ask a random native speaker, they might think that they are making their Chinese very easy, but it could still be very difficult for you. But if you have a teacher and you're able to tell them roughly what you know, maybe you can refer to a textbook and say you've studied so and so many chapters here or something else, just talk with them for a bit and they will be able to figure out how much you know. An important thing to remember here is that you need to tell your tutor that your goal here is not to learn more words and more grammar, but rather to engage with language that you can make sense of and understand using the words you have already learned. So to summarize, we can say that the key to beginner reading in Chinese, and actually this is true for intermediate and advanced reading as well, is to read as much as you can at your current level or maybe slightly below it. And remember, when I say read as much as possible, I don't just mean that you should spend a lot of time reading, I also mean that you should cover as much text as possible, and that is only possible if the texts are rather easy, otherwise you will spend almost all your time on a few short, difficult texts. So make an effort and try to find reading materials that you can make sense of without constantly using a dictionary or a word list. In this episode, I have shared 7 ways of doing that. And if you have other ideas or resources that you want to share, please let me know. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.